Esteemed colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to this event, which is organized by the Anis Maqdisi Program in Literature in collaboration with the Physics Department. Today's lecture comes as part of a series of activities that we are undertaking on campus throughout this academic year, and that would continue also during the fall of next year. And these are centered around reflections on various outlooks concerning the moon. They have been planned in partnership with Dr. Jihad Touma, my partner in this initiative, who is at the Physics Department. And also this has been undertaken in association with Dr. George Saliba at the History Department. He's a historian of science. And we have a partner in the Department of Architecture who is Dr. Karim Najjar. The events that we have been planning for this year and continuing in the fall relate to astrophysics, aerospace engineering, selenography in the history of the exact sciences, along with reflections on inspirations drawn out from reflections on the moon in literature, poetry, the visual and performing arts, including now we have a design studio that is being undertaken at the Department of Architecture under the title Lunotopia to design a moon colony. And this has been done as part of this collaboration. And we are planning a night of local music and songs in Mashghara in the summer to be also drawing on the kind of, lunatic kind of orientations in our celebration of our neighbor, the moon. And there'll be also an astrophysics workshop that will be planned for the fall, along with various other lectures, all centering around this celebration of the moon at AUB. Today's public lecture is entitled Looking Back at Earth Ahead of the Apollo 11 Manned Moon Landing, and with a focus on political activism in the wake of May 1968. The thematic orientations focus on the era of the Apollo missions that predated the manned moon landing in 1969, while placing an emphasis on the Lebanese student movement at the time and in the post-1967 period, the period of also the Battle of the Karama, and the attitudes towards the Vietnam War. And this comes thematically 50 years, nearly 50 years after the Apollo 11 space flight, whereby today we are seeing also the return to the geopolitical race back to the moon and how it is regaining a momentum in what perhaps has certain traits of a different kind of war, a different kind of Cold War. We are privileged to receive today's public lecture from an eminent speaker within the Lebanese academic and intellectual milieu, Dr. Fawwaz Traboulsi, who lectures at AUB and LAU in modern Arab history and politics, and who has been a visiting professor at numerous universities in the United States and Europe. And besides his academic profile, he is a distinguished journalist and the editor of Bidayat Journal. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you very much, Nader Bizari. Thank you all organizers. I was wondering why you chose me and what relationship do I have with the moon to start with. Now things are even more complicated after we entered in astrophysics. I'll retain from this the question of Mashghara. I don't know if you know that I come from Mashghara and I have a book called Ya Amar Mashghara. So if you knew that, that's okay. That's one reason why I'll be happy to address this meeting. As usual, I start with linguistics. So it's very interesting how words change. In my days, which we're going to talk about, we would talk about militantism. now we talk about the most politically correct term of activism. And they're not the same. So let me start by emphasizing that militantism meant taking position, meant fighting for something, whereas the more neutral activism is that you're active in something. I mean, not necessarily wanting something else. But the more interesting thing is that the term militant now has moved to terrorism. So if you want to distinguish between people who are active, you can talk about everybody is an activist except the poor jihadis, they are militants. So I'd still stick to myself as, at that time, a student militant, which I think I am not a student anymore. While thinking about what I was going to talk about, I discovered how rich life at AUB was from 1965 to 1968. Of course, how rich the life in the whole country was. I could start with a basic, perhaps founding event, which is 1965 and the beginning of Palestinian Fida'i organizations entering AUB. They were acronyms then, so you'd say about Jetafa or Metafa, and they were secret. But very quickly, a number of students joined them, and there was, of course, the celebration of the first military operation by Fatah, and more importantly, the need now to express something more obvious concerning Palestine. But I should remind that there was a tradition even before 65 of demonstrations which started from AUB. What you would have usually is the Maqasid school students moving to AUB at the what was called that still is the hospital gate, joined by the students of AUB, and into actually going into Burj through what used to be called the France Street, which was ultimately what was known as Wadi Abu Jamil, mainly the predominantly Jewish quarter, and then from there into Bab Idris and Place des Canons. I should mention that no damage was ever done, as far as I remember, in those demonstrations to houses or properties in Wadi Abu Jamil. But what was interesting is that, of course, a lot of those demonstrations prior to 65 and then after 65 had to do with Algeria. And of course, there was a major event in which, in one of the demonstrations in Algeria, under the premiership of Abdallah Al-Yafi and Camille Chamoun, there were shootings at the students coming out of AUB hospital gate, and at least one of the students was killed. He was a member of the Socialist Party of Kamerjamblat by the name of Hassan Abu Ismail. So that was a landmark, and in fact, the real militantism of the 60s started with solidarity with the people of Algeria, with the struggles of the people of Algeria. Now back to 65. In addition to Palestinian militantism was the question of Vietnam. But first there was a decision taken by active students at that time to break the ban on demonstrations. And if I remember well, by 65, late 65, we had managed to stage the first demonstration on campus. At first, silent, then we broke the silence and started shooting. So that was the first time demonstrations were carried on, on the campus. Now, for Vietnam, I was a member of a group of students which called themselves social students, and we produced a pamphlet which I've given to Nader Bizri about the Vietnamese war in Arabic and English. That's January 66, if I'm not wrong. Yes, January 66, that was distributed clandestinely, but it earned me, if you're interested, a 20 years ban from entering the United States. No problem. 1971 to 1991. Then I was allowed in. I discovered that there was something called the B list. So the B list was deleted when the Soviet Union collapsed, and I was one of the lucky people who were allowed in starting from 1971. The important thing about raising the issue of Vietnam was a show of strong solidarity with an issue that was at that time quite important and not really reduced to the interest of the student community. Of course, at that time I was just taking my BA and starting graduate work, and I should mention one basic influence on me and on many students, the late Hanna Batato. Hanna Batato had the courage of teaching all the red line issues like Marx, Engels, the Iraqi Revolution of 1958, the Russian Revolution, etc. And I was lucky not only to be his student, but to be his GA. And I don't know how much GAs get now, but at that time I used to receive $300, which were huge by that standard. 1966 should lead us to 1967. And in fact, in answer to the question of May 68, in fact, the main events in student life, not only at AUB, were, of course, June 1967. Of course, that was the shock of the defeat of the Arab armies in June. But once, a few days before, a lot of our people stayed on campus, and what we did is practically take over the university. We established a radio station in West Hall, one of the windows of West Hall, and of course, airing all the military marches and the fantastic news about victories. And we called upon our students to go and, of course, fight. So we had a good number of AUB students, Arab, mainly non-Lebanese by that I mean, simply leaving and going to Damascus on their way to, of course, the battlefield. And of course, once they reached Damascus, the war had ended. But that was a very hot period because, if I remember well, we declared something like the AUB Commune, took over Marquand House, and at that time you had two political organizations at AUB. You had the general Arab nationalists, and you had something called the Lebanese, what was it called? the Lebanese League. The Lebanese League was under the leadership of the late Kamal Salibi. It had mainly, let's say, phalangists or Lebanese nationalists. And there was a history of fighting on campus between the two groups. Of course, the nationalists were majoritarian, and at times, though the football players were mainly in the Lebanese league, but they still had to suffer severe beatings, and the occasion was the festivities of the creation of the United Arab Republic, the union between Syria and Iraq and Egypt. I'm just mentioning this because we managed to achieve, let's say, student unity at that time, and one representative of the Lebanese League sat with us on that long table at Marquand House. He would later become one of the leaders of the Kata'ib Party and the ambassador of Lebanon to the United States, Abdullah Abu Habib. And we were very happy of this, reuniting the students in the common fight against Taban, Israel. Now, during that period, there was, of course, the effervescence much more serious outside AUB, and a very heavy, long, militant march against the American embassy. At that time, the American embassy was just behind the basketball court. That was the embassy that was ultimately destroyed. And we had the idea that we should participate in the war by some forms of attacks against the US embassy. So we had two members of the Arab Cultural Club, which was a very popular club among Lebanese students, prepare Molotov cocktails. And the two, interestingly, and I should mention their glorious past. One was Fouad Sanyura. So he was very active in Molotov preparation, and he had his buddy, who is Issam Araji. So there was one window that faced us, and the idea was how to throw cocktail Molotovs high enough to go beyond the siege, whatever you'd call it, in the basketball court. And there was that Marine sitting and laughing at us at in that very small window. We're trying to shoot our cocktail Molotov through. We never managed, but the embassy was surrounded very, very heavily by angry demonstrators. It was one of the massive demonstrations of that time. So, of course, a lot of the anger was against the Lebanese government. We thought at that time, many thought at that time, that it should have participated in the war. And so the anger was not only directed against the American backing of the Israeli aggression war, but against the Lebanese state. In fact, what at that time was more also enervating was that the region of Hamra was full of Lebanese troops who were defending the offices of the oil companies. the oil companies were around Wardiya at that time, the headquarters of the oil companies. And of course, there was this outcry, you should be on the on the borders, fighting Israel rather than defending American oil interests. Now, during that period, while we were still taking over AUB, I was arrested for distributing a pamphlet now in Arabic and distributed quite evenly in Beirut and the regions, specifically on this very issue of the need for the Lebanese army to enter the war. Of course, under the Second Bureau, in the Second Bureau prison arrests, I had been lectured about why the Lebanese army could not enter the war, and of course with all the threats possible concerning that nobody has the right to the army in that sacred moment of national defense. The important thing is not what happened to me, but the fact that ultimately the security forces took over AUB and kicked out the students, and for a while AUB was shot and then resumed. So that's the saga of AUB in June 1967. I don't know if there's anybody here who remembers anything about it. And I was wondering, I was telling Nader Wizri, it would be interesting to see in the archives of AUB if there is any trace of all this happening. Photos, pamphlets, reports, what have you. I don't know. I don't know if anybody now could. Now, we reach 68. At that time, I had left to continue my studies at SOAS in London. And I should say two things now about 68. The first, concerning the difference between June 67 and May 68 is enormous. Whereas June 67 is the event that shook people, rallied people. May 68 was not very important. For myself, I joined May 68 in London. Very interesting demonstrations. We occupied London School of Economics, and then to Paris, where I met comrades who had who were vaunting what they did on the barricades. But during that time, the initiative concerning May 68 had moved to mainly the École des Lettres and the USG. In the École des Lettres especially, there was a very active student movement called the Front des Forces Estudiantines, the Front of Student Forces, a left-wing student organization, very active from 65, which did a lot of activities, but as far as I can recall, and others too, there was no street activity celebrating May 68 in Lebanon. There was student activity in the École des Lettres. All I remember is an interview in Al-Nahar with two of the leaders of this movement, mainly Samir Frangieh and Amin Malouf, who at that time were quite representative of that current of the student left, which is the Front des Forces Estudiantines. For the rest, summer was interesting, student-wise, if you want. because hundreds of French students flocked here. French student meaning real French students and Lebanese French students who were all coming back after such a glorious month from May to summer. And of course, a lot of meetings were held, a lot of discussions were held, appreciation of what is May, how to continue from then on, etc., etc. So that's as much as I had wanted to tell you. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Hi. I wanted to ask when I wanted to ask when you used to do demonstration in AUB, how did the administration react? Were they supportive or were they not? Thank you.
There was a ban until that period I told you about, which, if I remember well, there was acceptance of silent. It was gradual. But as far as my memory goes, first it was an acceptance of silent ones, and then mainly on Palestine. I don't think there was any demonstrations inside AUB on Vietnam. That was two. But on Palestine, silent, and then I think towards the late 65, they became roaring, if you want, until 67, and I can't say much about 67, but my feeling is that they were banned. But somebody can look this up.
Hi, Munzir Alaili. So in retrospect, would you say that you have changed your opinion on your political stances during that time, given what happened in the events after, during the Civil War and with the PLO and the Israeli invasion? Would you say you regret taking those stances, or have you changed your mind currently?
Well, if you've read anything by me, you'll discover that I haven't. But
yes.
There is a difference. There is a difference when saying, have you changed your mind, or have you changed, or have you reviewed your positions? So I don't consider myself somebody who has renegated his past. I haven't moved from the left to liberalism. And if I have to make a confession of faith, that is the answer. But I did participate in the war, and I was just yesterday commenting on a film by Jocelyn Saab, and was asked the same question, so I'll reply the same answer. I am responsible for having sent people to fight during the war, and my assessment of the war is the following. The country was split on two issues, not one. It wasn't split on the Palestinian armed activities. It was split on internal reforms, social, political, and on the sectarian question. And what the camp I belonged to, which was called the Lebanese National Movement, tried to impose reforms, mainly the reforms of the political system, which at that time meant the end of political sectarianism, reform of the electoral system, and an optional personal status based on a civil option. Those main demands, in addition to economic and social demands, the idea was that you can impose them by force. And trying to impose them by force vis-à-vis a militia which was started to organize before the left, helped the breakup of civil war along what became easily sectarian lines, sectarian divisions. بس يعني I've written some 20 books to say this يعني عم لخصهم بكم كلمة. Okay.
Thank you very much for such an enlightening reflection on the past for us. Just a couple of unconnected questions, really. One is that when Malcolm X comes here in 1965, I think it was, do you have any sort of recollections of that time, the two visits he makes, the first one where the university doesn't allow him to speak, and the second one where he actually ends up speaking? That's just a small question. The next one really is how has the defeats of the left over from 60s to the present, shaped, if you like, the Lebanon and the region, and what can progressive forces of today aim against and fight against, and how do you think they should do that?
For the first, frankly, I don't remember. I mean, which is strange, but it's a question of what you suppress or what drops out of your memory. Though I'm a great admirer of Malcolm X. For the second, I think it's a very vast question. I don't think we should. Many things can be interpreted in the name of the absence of the left. I think the left played its utmost role by 1976. It was defeated, and the major transformations in the, if you want, political sociology of the Lebanese tended toward the growth of sectarian organizations and sectarian loyalties, where inter-sectarian parties had become marginalized. So my take would be that in those circumstances, what came worse after that, what you have are remnants of the past major parties of the left or major organizations. I mean, if you're talking about on the general Arab, I mean, the Sudanese party was butchered, the Iraqi party was butchered, and the Lebanese lost a lot during the war, and because of the war, the Lebanese left. The participation in the national resistance against Israel was not enough to revive the left. One of the reasons was that it was first accepted and then banned from participating, and to the benefit of Hezbollah, which was a known Syrian policy. But what's important is that my answer would be there is a new left to be reorganized and reinvented, rather than what can the left do now. The left, what remains of the left, and the young generations who look forward to a leftist perspective, have a very difficult task, which is to rebuild practically from very, very small capital, let's say, another form of organization, totally different, to meet a totally different world, which is the world of globalization and neoliberalism. I mean, if this is not what you aim at, I think you're outside of what's happening. And many leftists, unfortunately, are.
I will ask my question in Arabic, and I apologize. Maybe you will translate them to English because it's more easy for me. إذا فهمت تعقيبا على سؤاله بتأرخ هزيمة اليسار ب 76 مش ب 82. هذا أول يعني الهزيمة الفعلية لليسار.
Do you date the defeat of the left in 1976 and not 1982?
This is my first question. My second question.
تحكي إنجليزي منيح؟
بعرف بس معلش بحب أعبر بالعربي. ثاني سؤال، الحركة التمردية اللي صارت على زيادة الأقساط بالأيوبي واللي رجعت عملتها رانيا الرفاعي وخيا بالفيلم ري اناكتمنت تبع الحدث الكبير. ما بعرف إذا شافوا الفيلم وقت اللي صار فيه عصيان وطردوا كتير تلاميذ كمان. أيمتى؟ 74. هل هالشيء بتربطه بكل شيء يعني قلته حتى ولو كان بشكل غير مباشر لأنه حركة ملفتة ودخلت التاريخ؟ هذا تاني سؤال.
Second question, how do you link what you've been saying to the movement of 1974, the student AUB movement against or concerning student fees?
ثالث سؤال بالنسبة لتأثير الماي 68. يعني أنت فواز ربطت يعني بشكل مباشر الحركات السياسية أو تمظهرات الحركات السياسية بهالتواريخ هيدي. بس نحن حسب بالمسرح وبالسينما شفنا تأثير كتير قوي لأيار 68 بالمسرح. وانت بتعرف قديش المسرح اللبناني اندغم بحركة الشارع بهالفترة ابتداء من هالسنين وحتى بداية الحرب اللبنانية لبل خلال الحرب. ومثلا بعطي مثل المسرحية حتى بالفرنساوي، الناس اللي كانوا يكتبوا بالفرنساوي مثل علاء الدين ان ميموريوم، والشيء اللي حسوها الكتاب اللي كانوا يكتبوا بالفرنساوي انه ما قدروا يلحقوا حركة الشارع ولا تأثيرات 68 ولا التمظهرات السياسية اللي كانت اليسارية. ففي منهم وقفوا واللي كفوا قدروا يحكوا بالعربي الدارج وقدروا يعبروا عن كل هالشيء باللغة مسرحية جديدة وكتابة جماعية. هن اللي إذا بدك عملوا ما يسمى مسرح أو العصر الذهبي لبيروت الستينات. فكنت بحب لو كان الشيء اللي عرضته كمان بينقرأ بس مش من السياسة المباشرة ولكن من انعكاساته على الأشياء الفنية.
شكرا حنان. The last question is about what was the effect of May 68 on the non-political, especially Hanan Haj Ali is referring to its impact in Lebanon on the theater production and on including the French-speaking theater. Now, for the first questions, I don't think it's easy to pinpoint one date for the problems and the defeats of the left, but 67 is a major event. I don't like to think about political movements in terms of military terms, but I think that from if you're talking about the region, from the late 60s, you have growing conflicts between the nationalist regimes and the left. Then in the case of Lebanon, 76 was important in as much as the left was a military force and was disarmed and suffered not alone from what I call the changing or socio-politics of a civil war. I think it's a process, but the end of the process is that it's better to talk about remnants, not without any negative meaning, but remnants of leftist movements, and raise the question of is the issue how do they continue, or is the issue how do they reconstruct in totally different circumstances, which I mentioned. That's one. Second, what's the second? So the 1964, I have no knowledge about 1964. What I can say is that 74. Sorry. All I can say is that there was always student militancy concerning fees at AUB. Let me use the occasion to say that at that time, that was, in addition to political movements, that was mainly the only student issue raised. And I don't remember much, correct me, the recent, the more young generation, if ever students raised what they learn at AUB. And please tell me, if you can, why. How come the content of education, forget about the language of education, was at least rarely, if not never, raised? It should say something about education, university education, private education, whatever. So I'm enjoying the luxury of raising questions if somebody would bother to answer. Now, Hanan, you're right. I was just answering literally the question of May 68 in Lebanon, in May 68 and the summer. But as you know, perhaps the more influential effect of May 68 all over the world was how it changed culture and how it changed on look at life, how it changed ways of life. And of course, what you're saying is very true concerning not only the theater, but I would say we are, or we did inherit all the after effects of the cultural and let's say moral after effects of 1968 in our culture. So absolutely right. I was just referring to the political aspect. But it was strange that now that I've been thinking about it, reminding myself, looking into some newspaper cuttings and asking friends who were active at that time, the impact of 68 was politically in the student movement. I couldn't find any street demonstration at that time. But of course, one should wait for the after effects of the event to look at the impact, and that's important. So anybody would bother to answer my question about how come the content of education is not studied, especially with two professors leaving?
Three points that I like to refer to. First of all, the impact of the rise of the Palestinian resistance movement and the Battle of Karame, because this is in my opinion, this is very decisive at that time, because thousands, literally thousands and hundreds of students flocked to the Fatah bases in the Ghor to join the resistance. This is one thing. Another thing is the Vietnamese Revolution, the rise of the Vietnamese Revolution. And third, the student revolution in 1968. My question, were you at that time, Fawwaz and the rest of the national movement or the student national movement, were you Marxist at that time, or you were pan-Arab moving in a left-wing direction? So if you can elaborate a little bit on the question of your self-educating process Marxist, Leninist, if you want, at that time. This is very important to me. Another thing, I mean, with regards to the question that you have just asked, the quality of education that people receive here at the AUB or at the LAU or whatever American-oriented institutes of higher learning give. I remember at that time producing an article in Al-Hadaf newspaper, actually, in which I said literally that the purpose of these universities is to produce spare parts for the imperial system, the US imperial system, and nothing more, nothing less. And if they failed in that, this is a different story. Like a whole generation of Arab nationalists, you know, coming out on campus, clamoring against imperialism and against Israel and all that. This is, in my opinion, a failure of the American educational system and its purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgiana. Of course, the highlights you mentioned are okay. The mood at AUB was Arab nationalist. There was never been any big contingent of Marxists, but there were a few to-be communist leaders who studied here, like Khalid Bakdash and Farouk Ma'sarani and others. But the mood in those days was very much nationalist. If you're asking concerning my intellectual developments, those were the years in which I studied Marxism and started considering myself a Marxist. Now, concerning the content, not the quality of education, I think I'm still surprised, but I want to point out to a discussion with Edward Said, which he later developed into a suggestion in the question. I mean, the bizarre thing is that AUB students are taught as if they are American students, which means they know very little about the United States before anything else concerning the content of education. That led Edward Said to suggest in his last, commencement speech, suggest the obvious, which is, why don't Arab students or students at AUB learn about the United States rather than being taught as if they're American citizens? And that's how Khazar was created. The idea, of course, Khazar was jumped upon by Al-Walid bin Talal. It rhymes, Khazar and Talal, and can't say much about it. I haven't followed it, but the idea of taking a distance first to know the American history, American politics, American society as non-Americans. At least this is one start. Now, what George is referring to is, of course, open to discussion. I mean, AUB had been very tolerant of real exchange of ideas. I mean, this is a university that produced George Habash. This is a university where you really had let's say, rich debates among the student population, apart from hitting at each other. But I wouldn't resume the role of AUB as such, but I'm still surprised to what extent there is no critical position, if need be, by students to start with, on what they're taught. I mean, they're taught to evaluate the teacher, but rarely the course. at least in those early periods, we would question a lot of the courses, a lot of the pronouncements of the administration. That was a period of intense anti-imperialist activity. And I don't feel, very frankly, that this became any tradition at all of critiquing or evaluating positively the content of what we learn. Yes.
On that question of
Yes.
the lack of student engagement with the content of the education we receive here, you mentioned right now that in the early 70s there were very interesting events that happened, I think especially in 71, 72, when the students, aside from protesting tuition fees, also created what they called the Free University. And this is an initiative that was started by a group of students who, in protest against the failure in their eyes of the university to address some controversial topics regarding politics, international relations, sex, Israel. They started their own classes, and I wanted to know if you had heard about it or if you had any memories of that. And so, I mean, yes, sure, there's nothing equivalent that I know about currently on campus, but I think that with the statement that was made earlier regarding the role of AUB or any American university as purely a sort of factory for students who will simply reproduce American imperialism, I wouldn't disagree that students, at least in the past, protesting was necessarily a manifestation of a failure of that system. I would say that actually it would be a reflection of how interestingly contradictory liberal American education can be, in the sense that it is simultaneously, yes, I would say in a way a perpetuation of American imperialism, and also I think the tools, the critical thinking tools that allowed students or enabled them to protest that very system is also part of the things that they acquired from the university itself.
Thank you, Geneviève. First, I don't know about that Free University 70-71. Interesting. I don't know who has researched it, but I would be interested to read about it. Now, first I would say that out of sheer curiosity and sociological curiosity, rarely has anybody bothered to study who are the students who come at AUB. Where do they come from, and who they are socially. Both Lebanese and non-Lebanese. Especially a big gap, especially that sociology now is no more interested in social research. Now sociology is all about, what's it called, post-coloniality and discourses. Curiously, I mean, it would be interesting, because that's related to something else. To be on a more realistic level, what does AUB prepare students to do after graduation? Where do those people go? And what's the content of the education, and how has it changed? For example, we might soon, of course, one from the purely educational point of view, what is now becoming more and more interesting and more a field of investment in education compared to what it was. Liberal education is no more where money is invested, where student comes. Now you're into everything related to IT and to business. And I think the arts and sciences might soon lose a lot of its disciplines because there aren't any students, or because there is no more interest to salvage what you might call liberal education. That's one. The other is much more difficult to talk about, but it's always interesting in any university. I mean, this is not a question peculiar to AUB, but what do education systems now, 30 years after globalization and neoliberalism, what are we prepared to, being prepared to do in life, and what values accompany us? Anyway, I think that is, from a purely academic point of view, before going any further, a very interesting topic. And there are disciplines at AUB which might help this kind of research, this kind of questioning. Can we stop here?
Well, thank you very much for a very stimulating session. And I think many of those questions that were raised around the educational system at AUB, I think would be very useful for us who are now considering restructuring the liberal arts general education program. Great. So maybe we'll have side conversations also around that. And thank you very much again for sharing this experience with us.